Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are plunging into something, well, really personal, I think.
That's
something
right.
fundamental to who you are deep down, but also something that connects all of us in a maybe a surprising way.
Hmm.
We're exploring this really profound idea of your life, not just as, a sequence of events happening,
Right, not just one thing after another.
but as a story you're constantly telling yourself, and maybe others too. How do you narrate your journey? How do you make sense of where you've been, who you are right now, and where you might be headed?
It almost sounds a bit, I don't know, poetic. Life is a
Yeah,
story.
it does, yeah.
But as the research we're looking at today shows, this isn't just some nice metaphor. It's actually a really complex, um, crucial, and active psychological process.
Mhm.
It really underpins our whole sense of self.
Absolutely. And to guide us on this deep dive, we're drawing heavily from, well, a foundational text in this field.
A really key piece.
Yeah, it's a fascinating chapter called Narrative Identity by one of the leading researchers, Dan P. McAdams, and you'll find it in the big Handbook of Identity Theory and Research.
Yeah, that chapter really serves as a cornerstone, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It lays out such a robust framework for understanding this whole concept.
It really does.
Everything from, where the idea came from, the theoretical roots, historical influences,
Right.
to how it develops across our lives, and those powerful cultural contexts that shape it all.
So, our mission today is to truly unpack this concept of narrative identity. We want to understand precisely what it is, maybe trace where this powerful idea came from,
And history?
explore how it takes shape and evolves, right through childhood, adolescence, adulthood.
A whole lifespan.
Yeah, and look at the influences on it, from those early chats with parents maybe to big cultural forces,
Why it matters.
and why it matters. Especially for you, listening. If you're interested in identity, in psychology, and maybe you're even thinking about a future working with young learners, right?
Yeah.
Helping them navigate the world and figure out who they are.
That's a great connection.
Mm.
Because if you think about it, think about those stories you tell yourself, just internally.
Yeah.
The explanations you come up with for why things happen the way they did, or why you feel a certain way about something that happened.
Right, the internal monologue.
Exactly. And then there are the stories you choose to share with others about your experiences, your struggles, your wins, what you hope for.
Mm-hmm.
According to the research we're looking at here, this act of shaping your life into a story, into a coherent, meaningful narrative,
Mm.
it's not just casual chat. It's not just reflecting now and then.
It's more fundamental.
It's absolutely fundamental to building and maintaining your sense of who you are, your psychological identity.
It's like the framework that holds everything together, maybe? Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's start right at the beginning. What exactly is narrative identity? How does McAdams define it?
Okay, so at its very core, McAdams defines narrative identity as the internalized, so it's inside you, and crucially, evolving story of the self.
Evolving so it changes.
Exactly. It's a story that each person constructs and kind of lives by. And its main function, its overriding purpose, is deeply human. It's to make sense and meaning out of your life.
Okay, making sense and meaning.
Yeah. And it's not simply a factual record, like an objective list of events in order.
So it's much more than just remembering what happened. It's about the interpretation.
Precisely. Think of it less like a diary just listing facts,
Okay.
and more like writing a novel about your life where you're both the main character and the author.
I like that analogy.
It has key components. It's a selective reconstruction of your autobiographical past. So you choose which events were important, how you remember them, what details stand out, the emotional weight you give them.
Right, you emphasize certain things, maybe downplay others.
Exactly. And this reconstruction gets woven together with a narrative anticipation of your imagined future. Where do you see yourself going?
Yeah.
What do you hope happens? How does the past lead to that future?
Ah, so it's not static at all. It's constantly pulling in new stuff and looking ahead.
Constantly. And the story serves a vital purpose both for you, the individual, and for how you present yourself to the world.
Right.
It explains for yourself and for others how this particular person came to be the way they are today.
Your origin story? Kind of.
Kind of. And where their life story seems to be headed, it provides that crucial thread of continuity and meaning across time.
Okay, that makes sense. And this psychological drive, this need to create a story like that, where does the research suggest it comes from?
Well, the source material connects this process back to some really foundational psychological theories, particularly Erickson's concept of ego identity.
Okay, Erickson. I remember that from Psych 101.
Right. Erickson proposed that a major psychosocial challenge, especially for people in late adolescence and emerging adulthood, so roughly around age 20, give or take.
That university age range, often.
Exactly. The challenge is navigating that identity versus role confusion stage.
Yeah.
This is the time when you're really grappling with those huge questions. Who am I and how do I fit into the adult world?
Yeah, big questions.
Huge. And the research suggests that constructing these comprehensive integrative narratives of the self, these life stories, is a primary psychological way emerging adults address this critical challenge. It's how they pull together all these different experiences, traits, roles into, hopefully, a unified sense of self.
Okay, so it emerges as a tool, maybe a psychological mechanism, for navigating that really significant transition into adulthood and finding your place.
Precisely. The narrative identity provides a person's life with that sense of unity, purpose, and overall meaning.
Unity, purpose, meaning, key functions.
Definitely. And just like a good novel, the research highlights that these life stories have structural elements.
Oh, okay. Like what?
Well, there's a setting the context of your life.
Yeah.
Key scenes, those memorable events. Characters, the people in your life, including you, of course. Plots, how events unfold, the challenges. And themes. Overarching meanings or values that run through it.
Wow, it really is like a story structure.
It is. It's a subjective historical account of your own development, shaped and interpreted by you. It provides an explanation for your most important commitments in life, like why you chose your career path or your significant relationships.
Right.
And the source material even goes so far as to say it offers a kind of moral justification of who a person was, is, and aspires to be.
That moral justification part is really striking. It implies the story isn't just about describing things.
Yeah.
It's about positioning yourself within a framework of values, right?
Yeah.
Making sense of your choices in terms of what feels right or good, maybe just to yourself. It's like validating your path.
It is. You're constructing a story that not only explains, but often, maybe implicitly, maybe explicitly, justifies the kind of person you see yourself as and the choices you've made. And while you mentioned emerging adults, it's really critical to understand this is not a process that just starts and stops neatly around age 20.
Right. It's not like you write the book, publish it, and you're done. Shelf it.
Not at all. The source strongly emphasizes that while the intense work of maybe formulating that initial life story often kicks off in late adolescence and emerging adulthood, it is fundamentally a lifelong project. The story is never truly set in stone. Narrative identity continues to be a significant psychosocial challenge, and a main way people make sense of their lives and other people's lives too throughout the entire adult life course.
Constantly revising.
Constantly, as new experiences happen, as your perspectives shift, as your roles change, you're constantly integrating these into that ongoing, evolving narrative.
So it's a dynamic living document that's always under revision. That makes perfect sense, actually. Now that we have a solid grasp on what narrative identity is, let's maybe dig into its history a bit. Where did this powerful idea come from in the first place? How has our understanding evolved?
It's interesting. The ideas that eventually became narrative identity really started bubbling up across different fields, social sciences, humanities, particularly around the 1980s.
Okay, so relatively recent in some ways.
In terms of being formalized, yes. But there were significant philosophical influences laying the groundwork much earlier. Thinkers like the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur.
Ricoeur, okay.
He explored the profound power of narrative, how it gives unity and continuity to our lives as we experience them across time. And then philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre looked at how narrative structures our understanding of actions and gives us moral direction, a sense of purpose.
So philosophers were already grappling with this idea that narrative isn't just for entertainment, it's fundamental to how we understand experience and morality.
Exactly. They saw it as essential to being human. And psychologists were building on earlier traditions too. Erickson's concept of ego identity was obviously crucial.
We just talked about that.
Right. But his work was maybe less explicit about the specific content and structure of how identity forms. It focused more on the outcome, resolving that crisis. Then you had personality theorists like Henry Murray back in the mid-20th century. Murray was a big advocate for studying individual lives really intensively.
The personological approach.
Exactly. He used various methods, including asking people to tell stories based on ambiguous pictures, like the thematic apperception test, the TAT. This
Yeah.
focus was often on uncovering motivational themes hidden in those narratives.
And this is where Dan McAdams really comes in, right? Taking these threads and weaving them into something central for personality psychology.
Precisely. Dan McAdams, in his really influential 1985 work, is credited with proposing the first full theoretical model of narrative identity, specifically designed for empirical psychological research.
And making it testable.
Exactly. He took Murray's approach, but applied more rigorous, systematic methods, kind of like those used by David McClelland, who coded motivational imagery in stories to analyze the actual product of identity formation, the life story itself. McAdams was focused on analyzing the content, what's the story about, and the structure, how is it put together.
Okay, so the first wave of research was looking for things like dominant themes. You mentioned agency and communion.
That's right. Agency themes, stories about having impact, achievement, control. Communion themes, stories about love, intimacy, connection, belonging.
Gotcha.
And they also looked at the narrative structure, like how complex it was or how well it hung together its coherence.
Right, does it make sense as a story?
Exactly. And building from that foundation, early research started connecting specific features of these life narratives, the content, the structure, to a whole range of other psychological characteristics and outcomes for people.
Can you give us some more specific examples of those links from the source? This is where it gets really fascinating, seeing how the story connects to the person.
Certainly. Research has pretty consistently shown correlations between narrative features and personality traits. For instance, people who score high on neuroticism,
Okay.
they tend to construct life stories that have more negative emotional tones, more themes of, things going wrong or feeling bad.
Makes sense.
Conversely, those high in agreeableness often tell stories with more themes of communion, focusing on relationships, getting along, connection.
Okay, traits are reflected in the story's flavor. What about well-being?
That's a big one. Individuals who report higher levels of psychological health and general well-being, they tend to have life stories that show high levels of narrative coherence.
The story hangs together well.
Right, it feels like it makes sense, it flows logically, and their narratives are also more likely to feature themes of redemption.
Redemption. So, turning bad things into good outcomes.
Exactly. Where a negative or challenging experience is followed by a positive outcome, personal growth, or finding meaning in it. They also tend to show more emotional closure on difficult events and a sense of personal growth and integration overall.
So, the way we structure our stories, especially about the tough stuff, is really tied to how well we're doing psychologically.
It strongly suggests a powerful link.
Yeah.
The research also found, for example, that depression is associated with constructing life stories where contamination sequences are common.
Contamination sequences, what are those?
They're kind of the opposite of redemption. It's where a scene or an event starts out positively, maybe with hope or success,
Okay.
but then it suddenly turns bad, gets spoiled, or contaminated. This pattern can really reinforce feelings of helplessness or that feeling that good things just don't last.
The rug being pulled out from under you, narratively speaking. That makes intuitive sense in relation to depression.
It does. On the flip side, successfully recovering from psychological distress like trauma or mental health challenges is often associated with life narratives that are rich in themes of agency.
Agency, so feeling like you have some control back.
Yeah, a regained sense of personal control, determination, the ability to influence your circumstances.
Interesting.
The source also includes some findings linking narrative to broader social or even political values. For instance, it talks about a study done with highly religious American Christians.
Okay.
And it noted that within this group, political conservatives tended to highlight life narrative scenes, emphasizing things like strict authority, personal discipline, the purity of the self, suggesting maybe an underlying narrative concerned with maintaining order, avoiding chaos. In contrast, politically liberal Christians in that study tended to tell stories featuring themes of empathic caregiving, self-expansion,
Right.
with their narratives suggesting maybe a parallel concern with fostering connection and avoiding a sense of, say, emptiness.
That's a really fascinating example. And it's important, like you said, the source presents it as a research finding, illustrating a connection.
Exactly.
Not taking sides or endorsing any view, just showing how these broader values can show up in personal stories.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's just showing how cultural and social forces can influence the narrative frameworks we end up adopting.
Right.
Now, while this initial research really focused on this idea of an integrative life story, a single coherent narrative,
Right.
The concept of narrative identity has also evolved. It's incorporated alternative perspectives that kind of question that idea of a single, perfectly unified story.
You mentioned this earlier, the idea of multiplicity versus unity. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, this critique often comes from sort of postmodern or social constructionist perspectives,
Okay.
and specifically from discursive psychology. Thinkers like Kenneth Gergen or Avril Thorne.
Okay.
They've argued that the idea of one grand, integrative life story might be a bit unrealistic in our complex modern society. They suggest that maybe our life stories are smaller, more specific to particular social interactions.
Ah, like different stories for different situations.
Exactly. Less integrative, maybe more temporary, more shifting. The identity is seen as something you perform and negotiate in specific social contexts through language.
So who you are depends on who you're talking to, in a way.
In a way, yes. From this viewpoint, the self in modern society can get saturated with all these complex, sometimes contradictory demands and expectations. And that can lead to feelings of fragmentation or multiplicity rather than a stable, unified identity.
That sounds potentially quite stressful.
It can be. Theorists like Hubert Hermans use the metaphor of the polyphonic novel for the self.
Polyphonic, like multiple voices.
Exactly. Suggesting the self is composed of different voices or self-positions that might express themselves differently, sometimes even conflicting with each other. Similarly, Raggett talks about multiform identities, where people hold potentially opposing images or narratives of themselves because life is just too complex for one neat story.
So are these perspectives saying the original idea of a single cohesive narrative identity is just wrong?
Well, the source material explains that McAdams, while he acknowledges the validity of these points,
Yeah.
few people achieve perfect integration, and social context clearly matters a lot.
Right.
He still maintains that even amidst all this complexity and multiplicity, people generally retain a fundamental psychological drive to make some narrative sense of their lives as a whole.
Some sense, even if it's not perfect.
Exactly. Even if the story is limited, maybe imperfect, maybe includes contradictions, the effort to connect past, present, and future into a meaningful account, that is what constitutes narrative identity in his view. It doesn't have to be some grand, perfectly unified epic to serve its function.
That feels like a more nuanced and maybe more realistic view for most of us, the striving for coherence, even if the reality is often kind of messy and fragmented.
I think so.
So given these layers of complexity and different viewpoints, how does this idea of narrative identity fit into the bigger picture of personality and selfhood overall?
McAdams and his colleagues propose a really widely accepted model that positions narrative identity as the third and sort of highest layer of personality.
3 layers. Okay.
Yeah, they suggest we can understand personality in terms of 3 integrated levels. Layer 1 is dispositional traits.
Traits like the big 5, extroversion, conscientiousness.
Exactly. Those broad, relatively stable descriptions of your behavioral style that show consistency across situations and time, how you generally tend to act.
Okay. Layer 1, traits. What's layer 2?
Layer 2 is characteristic adaptations. These are more contextualized aspects of your personality. Things like your personal goals, your values, your motives, defense mechanisms, coping strategies, even your relationship styles.
Ah, so more specific to situations and what drives you.
Exactly. They fill in the details about what motivates you, what you care about, how you interact with your world in specific roles or contexts.
Okay, traits are the general style, adaptations are what you do, and value specifically. So layer 3 must be.
Layer 3, layered over the other 2, is narrative identity. This is the integrative life story that weaves together those basic traits and those more specific adaptations into a meaningful whole. It provides the overall sense of meaning and purpose in your life, situated within your culture and unfolding over time.
So it connects the dots.
Exactly. Traits tell us how you tend to act. Adaptations tell us what you want and value. But only narrative identity tells us what your life means to you and how you became the person living that life. A really comprehensive understanding of personality, according to this model, needs all 3 layers.
That provides a really powerful framework for thinking about the whole person. And the source also talks about this layered approach in terms of how we experience the self developing over time, building on William James.
Yes, exactly. Building on James's classic distinction between the subjective I, the self as the knower, the experiencer.
The one doing the looking.
Right. And the objective, me, the self as the object of knowledge, the thing that is known or observed about yourself.
The self in the mirror, so to speak.
Kind of. McAdams and Cox propose 3 guises of the self that emerge one after the other across the life course. The self as actor, the self as agent, and the self as author.
Actor, agent, author. Okay, walk me through those.
The self as actor emerges really early, around the end of the first year, maybe solidifying around age 2. This is when the subjective I starts to recognize the objective me as having certain stable qualities or tendencies. Kids recognize they have preferences, consistent behaviors, basic traits.
Like recognizing I'm shy or I like playing with blocks.
Exactly, a basic sense of a consistent pattern of being. Then, in later childhood, usually around ages 4 or 5, something crucial happens. The development of theory of mind.
Theory of mind. Understanding other people have thoughts and feelings different from your own.
Yes, and understanding that your own behavior, and others, is driven by internal mental states like desires and beliefs. Things like wanting a cookie or believing mom hid it in the jar.
Ah, right, the classic mind reading examples. Understanding the why behind actions, not just the what.
Precisely. Baron Cohen calls it mind reading. And it's absolutely essential for social interaction and for understanding characters and stories, including yourself as intentional beings, with goals, plans, motivations. This is when the self emerges more fully as an agent. The me expands to include these dynamic, goal-directed parts.
So you see yourself as someone who does things for reasons.
Exactly. And the source notes, interestingly, that children with autism spectrum disorder who often struggle with theory of mind, sometimes described as mind blindness, they can have considerable difficulty constructing sensible narratives about themselves. It really highlights how fundamental this capacity is for self-storytelling.
Wow. Okay, so we have the actor, the agent. What about the author?
The author emerges later, typically in adolescence and especially in young adulthood. This is the point where the subjective I takes on the role of actively trying to integrate and make sense of the actor's traits and the agent's goals and desires. It starts fashioning the objective me into a comprehensive, self-defining story.
So this is where narrative identity really kicks in.
Yes. Narrative identity, this evolving life story, emerges specifically when the I becomes this conscious storyteller, trying to weave together past, present, and the anticipated future into a coherent whole.
Okay, so identity is broad traits, roles, values, all that. But narrative identity is called a psychosocial first among equals. Why that specific phrasing?
Because, as the product of the authoring self, it's the narrative that provides the overarching framework. It's the story that tries to bring all those other pieces of identity, your traits, your values, your relationships, your experiences together into a cohesive, meaningful whole. It gives unity, purpose, meaning within your life over time, in your culture. It sits on top, providing the grand structure.
That makes a lot of sense. Understanding what narrative identity is and where the concept came from sets the stage perfectly for exploring how it actually develops across our lives. And you hinted earlier, this starts way before adolescence.
It absolutely does. The sophisticated process of building a narrative identity rests on foundational cognitive and social skills that start developing right from infancy and early childhood. At the most basic level, human stories are really accounts of human intention unfolding over time.
Human intention. That's the key starting point.
It seems to be a really crucial building block. Research indicates that even by the end of their first year, infants show this remarkable ability to see other people as intentional agents.
Even before they can talk.
Yeah. They understand people act in goal-directed ways. They get that when someone reaches for a toy, they want that toy. They implicitly grasp that characters in simple stories have goals.
They understand the motivation, the wanting.
Exactly. That understanding of intentionality is critical. Then in the second year, around age 2, we see the really critical emergence of the autobiographical self.
Okay, autobiographical self.
This is where that duplex I-me configuration starts to form. The subjective I begins to observe, experience, and importantly, attribute events to the objective me.
So they start collecting memories about themselves, like, this happened to me.
Yes. Researchers like Howe and Courage point to this time as when children begin encoding, collecting, and even trying to narrate these early autobiographical events, their little stories about what happened to me. So the dawn of a self that persists through time and has experiences.
And this early self-storytelling, it doesn't just happen inside their heads, right? It's deeply social.
Very much so. The development of autobiographical memory and the ability to tell personal stories is heavily scaffolded, built up with help within social contexts, primarily through conversations with caregivers, usually parents.
Parents asking, what did you do today?
Exactly. Parents encourage kids to share experiences from a very young age, prompting them to recall events.
How does that scaffolding actually work?
Well, initially, the adult usually takes the lead, guiding the child's recall. They might ask, remember when we went to the zoo? What animals did you see? Or, Who was at the party?
Leading questions, kind of.
Yeah. As the child gets a bit older, they start taking more initiative and recounting things. By around age 3, they're often actively co-constructing the past, in conversation with the adult, adding details, taking turns telling the story.
Like a team effort.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And by the end of the preschool years, kids who've had these kinds of supportive conversations can often produce relatively coherent stories about past events without constant adult prompting.
So it's a joint effort that gradually hands over more responsibility to the child, and the style of the parents' conversation makes a big difference.
Absolutely. This is a key finding highlighted in the source from researchers like Fivish, Nelson, Quebley, Reese, and Ferrand, an elaborative conversational style.
Elaborative, meaning?
Meaning the adult asks open-ended questions, encourages the child to reflect, helps them elaborate on their experiences, asking not just what happened, but how did you feel? What did you think about that? What happened next?
Going deeper than just the facts.
Exactly. That elaborative style is strongly linked to children developing richer, more detailed, and more coherent autobiographical memories and personal stories later on.
So prompts like, tell me more about the painting you made, are better than just, did you paint today?
Much better.
Yeah.
In contrast, a more constricted or repetitive style, just asking for facts, maybe yes-no questions, is associated with less articulated, less detailed narratives from the child.
Interesting.
The source also mentioned some research suggesting potential gender differences. Mothers might encourage daughters more than sons to share emotional experiences, especially negative ones, which could contribute to girls, on average, using more emotion words in their early stories.
This is incredibly relevant if you're thinking about working with young children, say in an elementary classroom.
Absolutely.
You can literally see these early narrative building blocks, understanding intention, remembering personal events, theory of mind, understanding thoughts and feelings, playing out every day.
Definitely. As a future elementary teacher, recognizing these developmental stages is vital. You'll have kids at different points in their ability to recall and tell about their experiences.
Right.
How you facilitate sharing time, how you talk to students about conflicts or successes, the kinds of questions you ask when they tell you something that happened. These can all act as powerful scaffolding for their developing memory and their first attempts at self-storytelling.
And being mindful that children come from homes with maybe different conversational styles or different cultural norms around expressing emotion.
Yes.
That could really inform how you create an inclusive classroom where all students feel comfortable sharing their developing stories of who they are.
Exactly. Supporting their ability to articulate their experiences in their own way isn't just about language skills. It's foundational to their developing sense of self.
So these fundamental pieces get established in those preschool years. What happens as kids move into elementary school and their thinking gets more complex?
Well, in the elementary school years, children continue to refine their understanding of story structure itself. By around age 5 and onwards, they acquire a pretty robust grasp of story grammar.
Story grammar. You mean like understanding that stories need characters, a setting, a problem, a resolution?
Yes, exactly. The canonical features that make a story work. They understand stories have settings, characters whose actions are driven by desires and beliefs, a sequence of events, a clear beginning, middle, and end, and some kind of resolution.
They get the formula.
They get the formula. They develop expectations for coherence, even suspense, and they often find stories that break these rules confusing or just boring. Interestingly, some studies show if you tell kids a story with inconsistent parts, they might actually recall it later in a more structured, standard way. Their internal story grammar is shaping their memory.
Wow. And they start applying this understanding of story grammar to their own lives, their own experiences.
Precisely. As they move through elementary school, children increasingly tell stories about their personal experiences in ways that fit these implicit rules of how a good story should sound. But another really crucial development during these years is they start internalizing what's called cultural biography.
Cultural biography. That
Yeah.
sounds important. What is it?
It's a concept highlighted by researchers like Habermas and Bloch. It's the process of learning the norms and expectations within your culture about what a typical or conventional life story should contain and how it should generally unfold.
So learning the expected plot points of life in your society?
Kind of, yeah. They learn about conventional life phases, being born, going to school, maybe leaving home, getting a job, forming a family, growing older. And they also learn the kinds of causal explanations that are considered sensible or normal within their culture for linking events in a life, why things happen.
Okay, so they're learning the expected script for a life and the accepted ways to connect the scenes to make it make sense culturally.
Exactly. Internalizing these cultural conventions gives kids a template, a framework. It helps them start to see how individual events in their own lives, memories from the past, maybe imagined possibilities for the future, can be sequenced and linked together to form the beginnings of their own life story outline. It's a scaffold provided by the culture for thinking about their life's path.
Thinking about the elementary classroom again, this idea of story grammar and cultural biography seems incredibly relevant. Understanding story grammar is fundamental for reading comprehension, for writing.
Absolutely. Creating and understanding stories, both fictional ones and personal ones.
So activities like identifying story elements, sequencing events, discussing cause and effect, even exploring simple biographies of people, that all connects to this.
It all ties in. You can guide students to think about different life stages. What was it like when you were a baby? What do you like now as a student? What do you imagine doing when you grow up?
And recognizing that students aren't just learning to write better stories, but they're actively internalizing these cultural blueprints for structuring their own life narrative.
Yeah,
That can help teachers support them more effectively, right?
exactly. It's about helping them find the language and the structure to talk about their experiences and their developing sense of self within the frameworks their culture provides. You're giving them tools not just for literacy, but for self-understanding.
Right. So these crucial building blocks are laid in childhood, but the transition to crafting really sophisticated, integrated narratives, especially ones with strong causal and thematic coherence that usually happens later.
That's right. Typically emerges during adolescence, according to Habermas-Buck's research again.
Causal and thematic coherence. Okay, break those down, going beyond just listing events.
Exactly. Causal coherence is about linking events meaningfully in your life story, explaining how one experience led to, caused, transformed, or is otherwise meaningfully connected to another event or aspect of your life.
Okay, like an adolescent explaining maybe why they're interested in a certain career by tracing it back to an early experience, or linking their political views to something specific that happened in their family years ago.
Perfect examples from the source material.
Hmm.
They're not just recounting events anymore. They're building explanations, constructing a chain of causality that makes sense of who they are now in terms of their past.
Okay, that's causal coherence. What about thematic?
Thematic coherence involves identifying overarching themes, maybe core values or central principles that integrate different episodes in their life story. It's about conveying the core gist or meaning of who they are, finding the central message or identity theme running through their narrative.
Finding the moral of their own story, in a way.
In a way, yes. And research, like studies by Habermas and De Silveira, confirms that both causal and thematic coherence increase quite substantially through the teenage years and into early adulthood.
So cognitive development allows for this more complex thinking.
Right, you need formal operational thought, abstract reasoning.
But adolescence is when the intense psychological and social pressure to actually do this narrative work really kicks in.
Yes, as Erickson pointed out, adolescence is that period of intense identity exploration.
Yeah.
And socio-emotional and cultural factors are huge drivers. Teachers, parents, friends, the media, they all, implicitly or explicitly, push the identity agenda. They urge teens to think seriously. Who are you? What do you value? Where are you going?
Mm-hmm.
Habermas and Bloch put it evocatively.
Yeah.
The culture tells the young person it's time to get a life.
Meaning construct a narrative for it, get a life story.
Exactly. And the source mentions that some of these early narrative attempts in adolescence can be, well, a bit dramatic or maybe unrealistic.
Ah, yes, the personal fables that David Elkin talked about.
Exactly. These are those early adolescent narratives that can sometimes be quite grandiose, maybe unrealistic,
Yeah.
characterized by that feeling of unique invulnerability or, conversely, unique suffering.
Right, tales of becoming a rock star overnight or saving the world or finding perfect love instantly or feeling misunderstood like no one else ever has been.
Totally. That feeling of being utterly unique, for better or worse, that's so typical of early adolescence.
So what's a function of these if they're unrealistic?
Well, the source explains their function. They are early drafts. They represent the initial, sometimes maybe clumsy effort to create a coherent narrative of self. Even if they seem wildly unrealistic, they're a starting point.
Okay, like a rough sketch.
Exactly. As the person matures through later adolescence and into young adulthood, these personal fables usually get edited, revised, maybe completely rewritten. They become more grounded in reality, reflecting a more accurate sense of personal abilities, social limitations, core values, and actual past experiences.
It's like sketching out a wild idea before you start refining it into something more plausible, more you. This refining process, this emergence of the author's self who's seriously constructing their life story, that seems to connect to an interesting finding in memory research.
It does, yeah. There's a really well-established phenomenon in memory studies called the memory bump.
The memory bump?
Yeah. When older adults, say people over 50, are asked to recall significant life events, they disproportionately remember events from their late adolescence and merging adulthood years, roughly ages 15 to 30, compared to other times in their life.
It's like that particular decade just stands out much more vividly in memory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, there are probably multiple reasons for this objectively important life transitions often happen then, like leaving home for serious relationships, starting careers.
Sure, big milestones.
Right. But a really compelling explanation, supported by the narrative identity framework, connects it directly to the emergence of that author's self.
How does that work?
Well, this is the period when, according to McAdams' model, the storytelling I really begins the work of authoring the me. As you start actively trying to integrate your experiences and build a coherent narrative of your life, you are investing those experiences from this formative period with special meaning, salience, importance within that emerging story. You remember so much about your emerging adulthood, at least partly, because that's when the conscious work of crafting your life story really got going, making those events central to the plot you were creating.
That's a really neat connection. The period when you start seriously writing the story is the one you remember most clearly later on. And we know the story isn't finished in emerging adulthood. What does the research say about how narrative identity keeps developing and changing throughout the adult years?
Yeah, the idea that identity just gets resolved in adolescence is increasingly seen as, well, an oversimplification.
Life keeps happening.
Exactly. Narrative identity remains a dynamic project throughout the entire adult life course. Adults are constantly integrating new experiences, planned transitions, like marriage or retirement, unexpected events like illness or job loss, significant gains and losses, shifts in perspective on who they were, who they are now, who they're becoming.
The story has to incorporate all that and keep making sense.
It does. The narrative is continually being refashioned to integrate these changes and maintain that sense of meaning continuity. Now, cross-sectional studies which compare different age groups at one point in time offer some suggestive developmental trends.
Okay, what do they suggest?
For instance, some studies suggest an increase in the complexity and coherence of life narratives up through midlife.
So maybe more sophisticated ways of structuring the story, linking events?
Seems like it. There also appears to be an increase in what's called autobiographical reasoning.
Autobiographical reasoning.
Yeah, the tendency to draw broader summary conclusions, make causal links, identify thematic meanings from your life experiences, getting better at figuring out the so what of events.
Extracting lessons or broader meanings.
Right. And this capacity seems to increase up through midlife, suggesting adults become more interpretive, more psychologically insightful in how they tell their life stories. Interestingly, studies particularly with older adults, say over 50, suggest some other shifts. These adults often narrate self-defining memories with a more positive emotional tone.
More positive.
Yeah, and report a greater sense of integrative meaning compared to younger adults. This fits with findings about a positivity memory bias. And in older adults, they tend to recall more positive and fewer negative details and emotions from the past.
So memories might get a bit warmer, fuzzier.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps simplifying in other ways, too. Older adults sometimes recall more general summaries rather than highly specific, detailed memories.
So the story might become more coherent overall, more meaningful, perhaps more positive in tone, but maybe a bit less detailed in later life.
That's what some of the research points towards, yeah. And the source also mentions the therapeutic technique of life review, often used with older adults.
Life review, reflecting on the past.
Exactly. Reflecting on past events to find meaning, value, a sense of resolution. Studies suggest that doing this can improve life satisfaction and reduce depression in older adults, which again just underscores how important working with your life story remains for psychological well-being across the whole lifespan.
It's clear that making sense of your life story isn't just a task for young people finding their way, but it's a vital, ongoing process for well-being at every stage.
It really is. And importantly, while we are the authors, we're not writing these stories in a vacuum.
Ah, right. You mentioned the culture co-authoring it.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Our individual narratives are profoundly shaped by the cultures we live in. Culture plays a crucial role. Different kinds of narrative identities make sense, are valued, are even possible in different cultural contexts.
So what counts as a good life story depends on where you are.
Very much so. What plot points are expected, what counts as a valid reason for why someone did something or why something happened, these are all influenced by cultural norms. For example, that finding we mentioned about finding positive meaning in negative events increasing with age. The source links that to internalizing cultural prototypes or models that show us how to make those kinds of interpretations.
And the source details one very prominent and influential cultural prototype, particularly in American culture, the redemptive self.
Yes, this is a specific life story pattern identified by McAdams, primarily through research with highly generative American adults.
Generative, meaning?
Meaning adults who are deeply committed to contributing to the future, to the well-being of the next generation through parenting, teaching, mentoring, activism, creative work, etc. Their life stories often follow a recognizable pattern.
Okay, what are the key features of this redemptive self narrative?
Well, as a narrative structure, it prominently features redemption sequences.
We talked about those turning bad into good.
Right. Stories where the protagonist experiences suffering, loss, or some negative state, but is then delivered from it to an enhanced psychological state or status. Beyond redemption, other common themes often include feeling like you had a special early advantage or blessing, developing a sensitivity to the suffering or injustice experienced by others, often in childhood, establishing strong core values early on, experiencing some kind of conflict between desires for personal power or achievement, agency, and desires for connection or intimacy, communion, and having explicit life goals focused on benefiting society in some way.
It sounds like a narrative arc of overcoming personal challenges, often feeling specially equipped or called to ultimately contribute to the greater good.
That's a good summary. The source presents it as acting like a general script or model of the good life for many generative Americans. And its cultural function is powerful.
How so?
It supports and sustains those generative efforts. It helps people persevere through difficult work or setbacks because the narrative frame suggests their suffering or challenges will ultimately lead to positive outcomes, maybe for others or for the future.
It gives meaning to this struggle.
Exactly. And it also confers a kind of moral legitimacy. It links the personal story to broader moral narratives and cultural values about what makes a life worthwhile. The source connects this to philosophers like McIntyre, who argue that having an orientation to the good woven into your personal story is central to identity in many Western societies. Certain narratives become cultural examples of a good or worthy life.
So the redemptive self is presented as one really powerful example of that in the U.S., linking the personal journey to a broader cultural idea of a meaningful, contributing life.
Yes, and the source traces its roots deep into American cultural history, seeing echoes in, say, Puritan spiritual autobiographies focused on deliverance.
Okay.
Benjamin Franklin's stories of self-improvement, 19th century slave narratives emphasizing emancipation, Horatio Alger's stories about rising through hard work, even contemporary self-help books and entrepreneurship tales.
Wow, so it's a theme that's evolved but really persisted over centuries.
It seems to have morphed through different versions: atonement, emancipation, recovery, self-fulfillment, upward mobility, but often keeps that core idea. An individual may be seen as uniquely chosen or blessed, overcomes obstacles to make a significant positive difference. The source suggests this translates a deep cultural script, sometimes linked to ideas of American exceptionalism, into these pervasive contemporary narratives of success, recovery from addiction or trauma, achieving the American dream. Highly generative Americans, in this analysis, are often seen as particularly skilled and enthusiastic narrators of this culturally specific format.
And again, it's presented as an analysis of a cultural pattern, not an endorsement.
Absolutely not an endorsement.
The source also makes it really clear that while the redemptive self might be powerful for some groups in the U.S., other cultures and even subcultures within the U.S. have very different narrative expectations and common forms.
Absolutely. The chapter gives examples to show this diversity, like Martin Luther's stories from 16th century Germany focused on divine grace and inner turmoil. They made cultural sense then, but they aren't a common narrative model today.
Right.
Or the example of a villager in rural India explaining their sense of calm by the type of food they eat. That explanation makes perfect sense within their community's beliefs about diet and well-being, but it might seem strange to someone in, say, contemporary Berlin. It highlights how context shapes what counts as a plausible or meaningful story.
And even within modern Western societies, things like gender, race, social class, can influence the kinds of stories people tell and the stories that get valued?
Yes, the source references work highlighting this. Feminist scholars like Carolyn Heilbrunn pointed out how traditional patriarchal societies often offered limited narrative templates for women's lives, maybe lacking stories of agency, power, control over their own destiny.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, the experiences of many minority groups, the source mentions African Americans in the U.S., might not always fit easily into the dominant narrative forms valued by the majority culture. Their experiences are shaped by unique histories and social realities that require different kinds of stories.
This really underscores that narrative identity isn't just a personal thing, it's also influenced by your social position, by power structures. The cultural library of stories isn't neutral ground.
That's a crucial point. It reminds us that while we are authors, the pen we use and the genres available are often shaped by the society we live in. The source provides more detailed comparisons specifically between East Asian and North American cultures to really illustrate these differences in narrative style and function.
Okay, what are the key findings there? That sounds interesting.
Well, studies comparing autobiographical memory in North American and East Asian adults consistently show some striking differences. North Americans tend to report earlier first memories.
Earlier, huh?
Yeah, and have longer, more detailed memories of their childhood compared to adults from countries like China, Japan, and Korea. Also, North Americans' memories tend to be more focused on the individual's own role, their feelings, their perspectives,
More self-focused.
more self-focused generally. And the source links this to different ways of thinking about the self, culturally.
Ah, connecting to those ideas of independent versus interdependent self-controls.
Exactly. Concepts from cultural psychology, popularized by researchers like Marcus and Kitayama. Western cultures, like North America, often emphasize an independent self, seeing the selves as distinct, autonomous, separate from others.
Right.
East Asian cultures often emphasize an interdependent self, seeing the self as fundamentally connected to and defined by relationships with others and the social context.
Okay, and that difference in self-view affects the stories people tell.
It seems to influence how events are remembered and narrated. Research, like a study by Wang and Conway, found clear differences in narrative content and function. European Americans recalled more memories centered on their individual experiences, focusing more on their own roles, thoughts, feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Chinese adults, in contrast, are more likely to recall memories of social or historical events and placed greater emphasis on social interactions and the roles of other people in their stories. They also more frequently used past events to convey moral messages or lessons for life.
So the focus is different, individual versus social, and the purpose or function of the story seems different too.
Exactly. Wang and Conway suggested that people from more individualistic cultures, like the U.S., might prioritize the self-expressive function of narrative, using stories to articulate the uniqueness, the depth, the breadth of their inner self.
Showing who you are individually.
Right. In contrast, people from cultures influenced by traditions like Confucianism, with its emphasis on history, respect for the past, learning for good social conduct, that concept of Ren, benevolence, moral vitality, concern for others,
Okay.
they might prioritize the self-directive function, using personal narratives more as guides for good social behavior, drawing lessons for how to act by reflecting on their own and others' pasts, including ancestors. Their narratives draw on both individual experiences and shared historical events to figure out life directions.
This really drives home that point you made earlier. Narrative identity is a co-authored psychosocial construction. It's not just something you cook up entirely inside your own head. It's a joint product of the individual storyteller trying to make sense of their life
Actively working on it.
and the specific culture they live in, with its unique set of available story types, values, and expectations.
It's a dynamic interplay. The culture provides the library of potential plots, themes, character types.
Right.
And the individual draws from that library, maybe revising and personalizing as they go, but always working within the possibilities and constraints offered by their cultural context.
This has such profound implications for you, the listener, especially if you're someone interested in psychology, identity, and maybe heading into a career working with children, like in education.
Absolutely. You will inevitably encounter students from incredibly diverse cultural backgrounds.
And understanding that their cultural background will likely influence the very way they approach telling stories about themselves.
Yeah.
What details they focus on, how they sequence events, what they see as a meaningful connection between past and present, what function their stories serve. Is it self-expression? Is it social guidance? Something else? That understanding is crucial.
It really is. Recognizing these potential differences can help you create a classroom environment that validates and supports a wide range of narrative styles and purposes, rather than just implicitly expecting every child's personal story to fit one dominant model.
You can help students develop their own unique voices and narratives, respecting the deeply embedded cultural frameworks that shape how they see themselves and their unfolding stories.
Exactly. Supporting them and telling their story their way.
Wow. This has been a truly extensive deep dive into a concept that turns out to be incredibly rich, multifaceted, and really central to who we are.
It really is fundamental.
We've defined narrative identity as that evolving, internalized story we build to make sense of our lives, to find meaning.
We traced its roots, philosophical ideas, early psychology, through McAdams' formal model. We saw how research linked narrative features to well-being and looked at that debate between unity and multiplicity.
We dug into its development, uncovering those crucial building blocks in early childhood, understanding intention, autobiographical memory, theory of mind, and how social interaction, like those parent conversations, nurtures them.
Yeah, and we saw how elementary school kids learn story grammar and cultural biography, leading into adolescence where causal and thematic coherence develop, refining those early personal fables.
And how that author self keeps reworking the story throughout adulthood, integrating new experiences with those interesting trends in coherence and positivity later in life.
And finally, we examined the huge role culture plays, from powerful prototypes like the redemptive self in the U.S. to those striking differences in memory and narrative function between East Asian and North American contexts, always co-authored with culture.
For you listening, with your interest in identity, psychology, maybe education, understanding narrative identity offers such powerful lenses. It gives deep insights into your own journey of sense-making, the story you are living and telling right now.
And it sheds essential light on the complex developmental path. Children and adolescents are on the ones you might teach someday, as they learn to make sense of themselves and their experiences through narrative.
And crucially, it equips you to appreciate and maybe navigate the profound diversity in how people from different backgrounds construct meaning and identity through the stories they tell about themselves and their place in the world.
So if, as this research strongly suggests, identity is indeed an evolving story, and we are, in a deep way, the authors of that story, even as our culture co-authors it with us.
What kind of story are you writing for yourself right now? What themes are emerging? What direction does the plot seem to be heading?
And perhaps, looking ahead, maybe especially if you plan to work with young people, how can you empower them to start seeing and maybe actively embracing the incredible narrative possibilities in their own lives? How can you help them find their voice to tell their unique, evolving story?
Lots to think about. Thanks for diving deep with us today. Keep exploring these fascinating ideas.
Until next time.